Jake was no stranger to strange sights on his ranch. He'd seen coyotes skulk past the fence line and once even found a rattlesnake curled up inside an old boot. But nothing, and he meant nothing, could have prepared him for what he saw that morning. It started with hoof prints in the dirt. Not unusual considering his horses roamed freely in their paddocks, but the smaller prints walking right alongside them? That was a new one. His stomach knotted as he walked closer, instincts twisting in his gut. Midnight, his prized black mare stood by the fence, saddle slightly askew. Her flanks twitched nervously. Daisy the palomino flicked her tail, restless. Jake ran his hand along Midnight's side. Her coat was damp, not the kind of damp that came from a morning dew, but a sweat-soaked sheen that said one thing. Someone had ridden her, and it hadn't been him. His eyes swept over the property like a hawk circling for prey. The paddock gate, wide open, latch dangling like someone had casually let themselves in and strolled out again. A couple of grooming brushes were scattered on the ground, and over by the stable door, one of his riding helmets lay upside down in the dirt. The picture was clear as day. Someone had trespassed, used his horses, and left without a single word. He racked his brain for answers. Teenagers, maybe? Daring each other for a midnight ride? But no. Jake knew this place too well. He knew this town too well. They wouldn't have the guts. And then he remembered a conversation at the mailbox last week. Karen, his neighbor with a talent for gossip and a tone that could make nails on a chalkboard sound pleasant. She'd laughed, making some offhand comment. "My kids just adore your horses," she said. "Such a shame they never get to ride them." He'd shrugged it off then, but now his gut told him otherwise. Pulling out his phone, Jake opened the local neighborhood Facebook group. If there was one place where all the drama in town fermented like old cheese, it was there. He didn't have to scroll long. Karen's latest post popped right up, the smugness practically oozing off the screen. A grainy photo of her kids sitting atop his horses, grinning like they just won the lottery. The caption twisted the knife. "Such a beautiful morning for a little horseback adventure. The kids had a blast riding today. So lucky to have this in our backyard." Jake's jaw clenched tight. His pulse thudded in his ears as he read through the comments. Neighbors gushing about what a great mom she was, giving her kids these magical experiences. Someone even asked if she'd booked a lesson. Karen's reply, smug like she was showing off a prize. "Oh no," she wrote. "The horses were right there. Kids need to explore, right?" Jake saw red. It wasn't just the trespassing. It wasn't just the riding without permission. She was bragging about it, turning it into a public pat on her own back. He took a breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Marching over to her house, shouting her down, that would just play right into her hands. She was the type to twist a story so fast, you'd end up looking like the villain in your own backyard. No, Jake needed a different play. And then, like the slow sunrise over his east field, an idea formed. She wanted to pretend her kids had a riding lesson? Fine, a riding lesson they would have. That afternoon, Jake sat at his old oak desk, fingers flying over his laptop keyboard. He drafted an invoice, clean and professional. At the top, bold as a sheriff's badge, equestrian riding lesson, payment due upon receipt. He itemized every detail. Horse rental fee, instructor fee, stable maintenance, equipment usage, all carefully priced. Grand total, $500. He added a friendly note at the bottom. "Thank you for supporting small local businesses." He printed it, folded it neatly, and strolled over to Karen's mailbox like he was delivering a Christmas card. Slipped it in, walked away whistling. The next morning, the storm hit. Karen came marching up his driveway, face blotched red, hair wild, gripping the crumpled invoice like it was an arrest warrant. She didn't waste time. "What the hell is this?" she barked, shoving the paper at him. Jake gave it a lazy glance. "Looks like a bill," he said, folding his arms. "You can't charge me for this," she shrieked. "My kids were just having fun. What, you expect a mother to pay for fresh air now?" Jake's expression didn't change. Calm, steady. "No, Karen," he said. "I expect a mother to pay for using my horses like they're a theme park ride, without asking. She scoffed, waving him off. Oh, please, they're horses. They don't mind. Besides, you weren't even using them. Jake took a step forward, voice low but firm. You let your kids trespass on my land. You put them on animals they don't know how to ride, without permission. You think these horses are toys? One wrong move, they could have spooked. Your kid could have fallen, could have been kicked, and you know damn well who you'd be blaming if that happened. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Then she rolled her eyes. Well, nothing did happen, and I'm not paying your ridiculous bill. Jake shrugged. Then I'll take it up with the HOA. Pretty sure they'd love to know about this. For a split second, he saw panic flicker across her face. She knew how tight the HOA was about property lines and liability. They'd find her faster than a mosquito in July. Still, she squared her shoulders. Fine, she snapped. Let's see what they have to say about you trying to shake down a mother. He watched her stomp off, knowing she was walking into a fight she couldn't win. He had the proof. The pictures, the posts, the security footage, and all the time in the world. Jake didn't expect her to go quietly. By noon, she'd already fired her first shot, a Facebook post. Long, furious, full of righteous indignation. Unbelievable, she wrote. Some people think they can charge hard-working parents outrageous fees for letting their kids enjoy nature. Since when do we have to pay to be part of our own community? The comments poured in. Some neighbors nodded along, fanning the flames. Others asked pointed questions. Wait, did you have permission? One woman asked. Karen skipped that one. Jake let her talk. He didn't need to say a word. Not long after, his inbox pinged. An email from the HOA, subject line, urgent inquiry regarding unauthorized business activity. Jake chuckled to himself. She was nothing if not predictable. He opened the message. The HOA had received a complaint about him running a horseback riding business without approval. They wanted answers. He sighed. Fine, let's play. He kept his reply crisp and professional. No, he wasn't running a business. He wasn't charging for services. He was billing someone for unauthorized use of his horses and land. Attached, screenshots of Karen's Facebook bragging and security footage showing her kids climbing into his paddock like they were sneaking into a concert. He signed off politely. I trust the HOA will consider the implications of allowing residents to trespass and use private property without consent. An hour later, his phone rang. Linda, the HOA president, a no-nonsense woman with a voice like gravel. Jake, she said, we need a meeting. Figured, Jake replied. The next evening, they met at the community center. Karen showed up early, armed with a stack of papers like she was suing the whole town. She slammed them on the table. This is harassment, she huffed. My kids did nothing wrong, and now I'm being billed like I stole something. Linda raised one eyebrow. Karen, the footage shows your kids trespassing, riding animals that don't belong to them. How do you justify that? Karen bristled. Jake never said we couldn't use them. Jake almost laughed. Maybe the locked gate was a clue, he said. They're just kids, she snapped. They weren't hurting anyone. Linda sighed. Karen, this isn't about kids being kids. This is a liability nightmare. If something had happened, who'd be responsible? Jake? Would you sue him if your kid got hurt? Karen's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Jake leaned in. I sent you a bill because you used my horses and property like a service without asking. You don't want to pay? Fine, but you're no victim here. Karen was losing steam, fast. The other board members weren't even hiding their annoyance anymore. One of them spoke up. Karen, it's simple. Your kids trespassed. You bragged about it. There are consequences. We can't make you pay Jake's bill, but the HOA can fine you for violating property rules. Karen's face went pale. Fine me? You're serious? Linda folded her hands. Very. Karen turned back to Jake, desperate. You wouldn't press charges, all right? Jake shrugged. I don't want to, but I also don't want this happening again. Karen sat there stunned, then gathered her papers and stormed out. Linda gave Jake a tired smile. Welcome to HOA politics. Jake figured that was the end of it. Karen had been slapped with an HOA fine, and he'd made his point clear. She'd stormed out of that meeting with smoke coming out of her ears. And he thought maybe, just maybe, she'd lick her wounds and finally leave him and his horses alone. But Karen wasn't wired that way. The next morning, Jake found her Facebook post was gone. Deleted. No big announcement. No apology. Just quietly erased like it had never existed. But it wasn't hard to piece together why. Overnight, word had gotten around. The security footage had made the rounds and sympathy for Karen had dried up like a puddle on a hot day. People weren't buying her story anymore. Jake thought that might be the end of it. He was wrong. That afternoon, he caught sight of her from his front window. Karen, standing across the street on the edge of his property line, phone clutched in her hand, gesturing wildly as she talked to someone. Jake didn't have to guess who. He could smell trouble from a mile away, and it was heading straight for him. An hour later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up to his front gate. Jake sighed, ran a hand over his face, and walked out to meet the deputy before he even had time to knock. "Afternoon, Mr. Callahan," the deputy said, tipping his hat, looking about as enthusiastic as a man heading to a dentist appointment. "We got a report of, unauthorized animal business activity." Jake gave a dry chuckle. "Karen?" The deputy nodded, flipping through his notes. "Claims you're running an unlicensed riding school, overcharging neighbors. You know, the usual." Jake shook his head. "You're kidding." "I wish," the deputy said with a long breath, "but I still got to follow up." Jake pulled out his phone without a word. He'd been ready for this nonsense. First, he showed the deputy the security footage. Karen's kids climbing his fence, wandering right into his paddock like they owned the place, hopping on his horses. Next, he brought up the screenshots of Karen's Facebook post where she bragged about her kids' equestrian adventure. Finally, he scrolled to the HOA email chain, confirming they'd find her for trespassing. The deputy took his time looking through everything, his expression going from tired to downright irritated. "Well," he said after a long pause, "this is about as clear-cut as I've ever seen. I'll go have a word with her." Jake crossed his arms and watched as the deputy got back into his cruiser and drove the short distance to Karen's place. She was standing in her driveway, practically bouncing on her toes, clearly expecting backup. But the conversation that followed wasn't what she had in mind. Her smile vanished faster than a dog that heard the word vet. Her arms flailed, her voice rising loud enough that Jake could hear her even from his porch. But the deputy wasn't having it. After a few minutes, he gave her a stiff nod and walked away. Karen was left standing there, glaring daggers across the street at Jake. He gave her a polite wave. An hour later, there was another Facebook post. Short, bitter. "Some people in this community are just so petty. Imagine calling the cops on kids for enjoying fresh air and animals. It's a sad world when people care more about money than kindness." Jake had to hand it to her. She was committed to her story, no matter how upside down it was. But this time, the comment section wasn't so kind. People had seen the footage. They knew the truth. And they weren't buying the victim act anymore. Some neighbors even got a little cheeky. One replied, "Hey Karen, mind if I borrow your car?" I feel like exploring. But even as the neighborhood turned against her, Karen still wasn't ready to let go. A few days later, Jake spotted her kids hanging around by his fence again, just standing there, watching the horses like they were trying to figure out if they could make another run for it. Jake walked outside, silent but deliberate. The boys caught sight of him and bolted. He shook his head. Enough was enough. The next morning, Jake made a call. Just a few, really. By noon, a professional equestrian trainer was at his property, setting up cones and a sign out by the front gate. It read, "Private horseback riding lessons, now accepting students." It started as a joke, just a little dig at Karen to twist the knife. But something funny happened. The phone calls started rolling in. Neighbors, parents, even a couple of adults who'd always wanted to ride but never had the chance. Turns out there was a real demand for riding lessons in the community, and before Jake knew it, his little joke had turned into a full-fledged side business. By the end of the week, he had his first group of students riding the trails. Kids learning how to groom the horses, adults figuring out how to saddle up without falling flat on their faces. It was a good time, and it brought in a little extra cash, something he hadn't even planned for. The icing on the cake? Karen's husband was the first to stop by and ask about lessons. "My daughter's crazy about horses," the guy said cheerfully. She and her brother wrote a couple weeks ago, and now they won't stop talking about it. Jake smiled because how could he not? Oh, I know, he said. I'm familiar. Karen's husband didn't catch the joke, but Jake gave him a neighborly discount anyway, just to see what would happen. 2 days later, Karen was at his front door. Again. This time she wasn't yelling. She wasn't smug. She just looked tired. Angry, sure, but tired. You think you're funny, don't you? She said. I try, Jake answered. She shoved an envelope into his chest. Inside was the exact amount her husband had paid for lessons. There, she snapped. You happy now? Can we let this stupid thing go? Jake tucked the envelope in his pocket, smirking. Sure, Karen, we're good. She turned to go but hesitated at the last step. Just so you know, she threw over her shoulder, my kids didn't even like your horses that much. They said your lessons were boring. Jake nodded, keeping his grin in check. Good to know. As she stalked off down the path, Jake leaned against the doorframe and watched her go. There was a certain poetry to it. Karen had fought him tooth and nail from the start. She'd called him names, dragged his reputation through the mud, called the cops on him twice. And yet here they were. She'd literally paid him to shut up. And better still, her tantrum had kick-started a little side business he never even considered before. Every time Karen drove by now, she had to see his students riding along the trails. Kids laughing, parents watching proudly, the sound of hooves filling the quiet mornings. All because she couldn't keep her kids off his land. Jake won. Karen learned a very expensive lesson. And the ranch? Well, it had never been busier. But just when Jake thought the saga was done, there was one more twist. A month later, he found a note taped to his mailbox. It was written in Karen's handwriting. He recognized the loopy, cursive letters immediately. He opened it, half expecting another complaint or some thinly veiled threat. But it wasn't that. The note read, My daughter's birthday is coming up. She wants to ride again. Do you offer party packages? Jake chuckled to himself, folded the note neatly, and slid it into his pocket. He stared out at the pasture where midnight grazed quietly under the morning sun. Things had a funny way of working out. He never replied to the note, but he figured Karen would get the message soon enough when she realized party packages at Callahan Ranch didn't come cheap. And next time, maybe she'd think twice before helping herself to someone else's horses.